Girl slips teacher a note. Principal calls police. The place where one is raised matters. Annabelle J. was raised until the age of 11 in the basement of her parents' house. But let's look together at the chain of events. Jane was an adventurous young girl. She'd been living her whole life in New Orleans. Her dream was to become a writer, and she's been devouring books since she was a child. She found the world of literature fascinating, and she was willing to dedicate her life to it. She'd lost both of her parents when she was only 3 years old. She'd been living with her aunt since then, but they never really got along. She moved out of the house when she was 18 and started studying literature. She loved parties. One night she was supposed to go from one party to the next, and she was waiting for a cab. Because the second address where she was supposed to go was in the outskirts of the city, no driver was willing to take her. She'd been waiting for longer than half an hour and started getting annoyed, so she started trying to get a hitchhike ride. A couple of minutes later, a red car stops in front of her. The driver of the car was a young, handsome, and charismatic man. Louis was on his way to a party himself, but they decided to spend the night just the two of them. She fell madly in love with him. He was funny, talkative, they seemed very interested in each other and tried to understand each other's backgrounds. She sensed how this man would provide the support she'd always needed. She dropped out of university, moved in with him, and she was on her way to becoming the writer she always wanted to be. They got married and she was on the verge of happiness. They started sharing their lives. There was just one minor issue, however. He would never tell her what exactly it was he was doing for a living. The rest of the time they would spend together would be so fulfilling that she didn't think for 1 second about how this could be an issue. After 1.5 years into the marriage, they decided to expand their family. On a chilly November night, she gave birth to a beautiful baby. He assisted the birth and they saw their baby for the first time together. Jane was so happy and proud of what they created together. Once the doctors had announced to them that it was safe to bring the little baby home, they jumped into the car and were heading towards their house. Jane was so excited to experience the environment of the house with a new family member. Once home, Louis helped Jane take off her coat. She was preparing to go and wash her hands, but Louis picked her by the arm and by force, he dragged her toward the basement door. Against Jane's begging and sobbing, he'd thrown her into the basement. She was still next to the door when Louis unlocked it, put their baby in her arms and said, "Her name will be Annabelle. Now go ahead and raise her." Jane thought this was some sort of very bad joke at the beginning. She fed Annabelle and slowly fell asleep on the floor right next to the basement door, exhausted. She woke up there. She started feeling how would this become less of a joke. She started shouting and punching the door, expecting for Louis to come and take her from there. It was all in vain. Annabelle was already crying, so she started feeding her again. She was accepting this more and more as a reality, but things were quite still foggy in her mind. There was confusion surrounding every bit of her. She went down the stairs and into the basement and was surprised there was no light. She wasn't at all often in the basement of Louis's home, but how she remembered it, there were some little windows that would let bits of light creeping in. It was weird for her, she couldn't find them anymore. She moved forwards and hit her leg on something sounding like metal. She kneeled to feel the object. It was a bucket. There was toilet paper next to it, and her heart almost stopped beating thinking about how Louis planned this from before without her knowing. With every step Jane took further, she was realizing this horrible reality more and more. She found a lamp and turned on the light. She was shocked to see what Louis had done. He turned the whole basement into a comfortable apartment. There was a bed with fluffy pillows and blankets next to one of the walls. In one of the corners, there were shelves with packed bread, bottles of water, and canned food. Suddenly, she heard the door unlocking. She'd left Annabelle next to the door. She rushed up the stairs, but the door had already been locked again. She felt how her body got numb and her mind stuck. She started crying and hitting the walls with her fists and feet. She stayed in the darkness for a long time, contemplating her next moves. She fell asleep again. She woke up starving, so she ate some of the canned food with some bread and drank water. She regained her strength. She finally found the light switch in the basement. She noticed there were metal plates screwed on the exterior side of the house walls. In case Jane would ever think of escaping, it was clear the only way would be the door to the basement. She'd seen the educational corner that Louis set up for their daughter. There were shelves of children's books, a table full of pencils, painting brushes, and notebooks. He'd even mounted a piano in the room. There were also music books teaching how to read notes and how to compose songs. The fact that Louis had thought of all of it behind her back terrified her even more, but the fact that he'd brought all these instruments for their daughter helped her think that Annabelle could have a proper education. Thinking about the well-being of their daughter made her heart feel joy and peace. She laid herself on the bed and started thinking about what to do next. Jane knew that her priority was to harm Annabelle as little as possible. The only option she had in order to reach the goal of causing the least suffering for her daughter was if she made this whole environment appear as if this was how things were supposed to be, as if that would resemble normalcy. She also knew now that Louis wanted her to raise their daughter and teach her stuff, so he probably wouldn't hurt any of them in the near future. There were too many variables, so Jane had thought it smarter to consider her next move step by step. It wasn't the time to plan an escape yet, but how to teach Annabelle to be cooperative, talkative, and an expressive young girl. Louis opened the door again and Jane ran towards it. She thought how asking Louis for his reasoning and plans would be a dead end. He'd never agree to a proper conversation about what was happening. So she was only closely paying attention to his attitudes, gestures, and actions. They met face to face at the doorstep. She saw the house, she saw an escape, she thought for a second of hitting him and running away. But she wasn't sure this was wise since he might already have predicted this would happen and was ready to catch her. Moreover, this aggressive physical interaction may cause Annabelle to get hurt, so she just showed him her hands. He handed Annabelle over and locked the door again. She was now ready to finally spend some time with her daughter in peace. She looked at the sleeping baby, her little cute face giving Jane hope. Hope that Annabelle wouldn't have a wasted life. She noticed that Louis had washed their daughter, so she was at least glad that she couldn't see signs that he would hurt or use her in any malicious manner. She picked up one of the books and started reading for the tiny girl. That was all she did in the first couple of months. She just read and talked to Annabelle. There was no one else she could talk to or express anything. While Louis took Annabelle, Jane wrote about her feelings and thoughts. She'd completed one poetry book in the time she'd been down there. For her sanity and the passion for writing, she was keeping a diary that she was ambitiously filling up with many details. Sometimes Louis would bring Annabelle cooked food and wine. She knew he was trying to keep her in the best condition possible. She just never understood why all this was necessary. Was he treated like this as a child as well? She realized how little she actually knew about her husband, but decided to eliminate these inconclusive ideas from her mind. There was nothing she could do about it until their daughter would learn how to talk at least. 3 years had passed. Annabelle was growing up as a beautiful girl. Jane was so proud of her evolution. She had no idea what was happening behind the door when Louis was taking care of her, but nothing in the child's behavior struck Jane as suspicious. So she assumed that even if Louis keeps her by force in the basement, at least they have a common goal to offer the best they could and raise a healthy person. At 3, Annabelle was able to express wishes and form small sentences. Jane was afraid that the big question would eventually come. Why are you and Daddy not in the same place? She was afraid of this question only because she didn't want to create confusion in the girl's mind. She had no idea what Louis had told her. One day, the little bright, now 5-year-old girl had returned to the basement, and Jane asked her, "What did you do with Daddy today? Did you have fun?" "Yeah, Mommy, the park's my favorite place in the world. I found many friends today. I'm sorry you're so sick and can't come. Daddy always tells me how much he misses you." Jane felt a tear escaping her eyes. What a maniac, she thought. She couldn't hold back her emotions and for the first time in 5 years started crying in front of Annabelle. She couldn't stop. Her daughter started crying too and they hugged. They stayed like this for some time until Jane asked Annabelle to draw her a flying pigeon. "I'll make you the most beautiful birdie, Mom." The little girl loved poetry and knew several poems by heart. She could already read some sentences. She loved painting and drawing things that she was looking out for when going with her father. Jane found out from her that she wasn't going to a kindergarten, but that a private tutor would come daily to their home and spend time with the girl. Jane was shocked. She was sometimes hearing Louis talking to Annabelle behind the door. Many times that was all she was doing when the girl wouldn't be with her. She had, however, never heard any unknown voices. She wanted to ask Annabelle everything, but she couldn't because she wasn't willing to inflict suspicion in the girl's mind. She was innocent. It wasn't her fault, so the mother knew she must restrict her own desires in order to offer Annabelle a peaceful childhood. Since the tutor's intervention, Jane was already noticing how her daughter's vocabulary and power of expression were increasing exponentially. She was at least happy that Louis is finding good people for Annabelle, and it became clear that until now, both her and Louis wanted to educate their daughter in the best possible way. When the little girl turned 6, Louis had sent her to school. He knew too that the chances Annabelle told people around her what was going on at home were greater if she was exposed to a lot of social contact, but he had always taught her how saint and clandestine the family must remain. "This house is your sanctuary, baby, and you wouldn't let anyone cross your boundaries and find out your secrets. Am I right, little girl?" The little girl was indoctrinated with the thought that the family's never something to be spoken about, and Louis would never allow her to visit her friends from school in their homes. She spent most of the first year of school in the park playing. Louis secretly didn't want that Annabelle got close to anyone, so he moved the girl from school to school every year. Jane's educational intervention was of great importance because she was teaching Annabelle all kinds of things which would help her keep up with the new environments and new ways of teaching and interacting. By the age of 10, the girl turned into a shapeshifter. Her ability to adapt was impressive. She was very mature for her age. This made Jane start having hope in escaping. One day, when Annabelle was 10 years old and just coming back to the basement for the evening sleep, Jane had decided to tell her everything. She told her daughter about her dream of becoming a writer, of how much she enjoyed being socially active, of how she fell in love with Louis and all the rest. Annabelle was speechless. She didn't know what was happening. Jane carried on telling her, "My dear, I'm unable to get us out of here. I'm not at all sick. Do you think I could be so coherent if I was so sick as Lewis tells everybody? I mean, think about it. I need you to take this diary. I prepared it the whole time for this moment. I know this sounds weird, but you must believe what I'm telling you. This is not normal. I'm locked in a basement while your dad goes around together with you. I haven't seen sunlight in 10 years. The next morning they woke up. Jane asked her daughter to hide the notebook and give it to her teacher, and Annabelle did so. Lewis had opened the basement door to take Annabelle to school. Jane went next to the door and listened. She heard the entrance door opening, and after a couple of seconds, Lewis asked, "What is it you're carrying, my sweet bird?" Annabelle replied, "Nothing. I'll help you get rid of this." It wasn't that relevant, I guess. Jane got petrified. She spoke no word at all to Lewis in the past 10 years, but she was sure of how this would break the silence, and it did. After dropping Annabelle at school, he'd returned to the house and hid his wife. He then left her alone in the basement again. She hadn't seen Annabelle in a long time. She would often hear the little girl asking Lewis what was going on, and he was always replying to how Jane's state was getting worse, and it was better if they were separated for a while. One night, Jane heard Annabelle whispering behind the door, "Mommy, you're right. I'm sorry, I want to help you." Jane's eyes sparked in the dark. "Hold on, baby girl." She started shaking, went to the desk and wrote something on a little piece of paper. She ran back to the door and slid the paper under it. Annabelle managed to bring the letter out the next day when going to school. The letter was a little messy, and at first the teacher didn't really know what to make of it, but Miss Ambrosi trusted her pupils and invited Annabelle into her office for a talk. Annabelle told her all she'd seen in the house, and the teacher was shocked. Because Annabelle was such an articulated young girl, no one ever suspected that something could have been wrong. The school called the police immediately to take care of the situation. On the same day, the officers arrived at the house. Lewis was not at home. They broke into it and crashed into the basement door. Jane couldn't believe the day had finally come. She was shaking and crying of happiness and relief. Lewis was not a new face to the police since he'd been involved in suspicious activities his whole life. They'd been looking for him for a long time because he wasn't respecting tax payments and he was involved in shady business social circles. He was accused of mistreatment. The news circulated the whole country through different news platforms. Jane saw sunlight again. We should always trust our children that they can help. Please act as soon as possible if something ever strikes you as not being in order around your neighborhood or other environments.